think we had a couple of technical issues there. Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me now. We can take two. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stuart, and welcome to this PwC webcast on the future of tax. I am Stuart. I will be your host today. I am joined by my colleague Jeremy, and the two of us over the next 45 minutes will be talking you through two main topics. The first of which being how we are seeing technology changing the world of tax. And the second one, what does that therefore mean for us as tax professionals, as people who work in the tax and or accounting industry? And what does that mean for us wanting to get into that area? Hopefully we'll give you some insightful information on how things will be changing, and we'll have plenty of time for questions. In that vein, at the bottom of the screen, the webcast screen, you should see a question and answer panel. Please do input your questions there, and we will endeavour to get as many of those answered for you as possible during the course of this 45 minutes, and we'll hear them right at the end. Good. So without further ado, we'll go straight into the subject matter, and I'd like to start with a quick question at all of you on the webcast, just to think a little bit more about what is your perception of tax. So just to have a couple of seconds there to think, what do you think tax is all about? Is it just numbers? Is it boring? Is it something that you have to do on an annual basis that you pass over to a tax professional and don't think any more about? Or is it something different? Is it a way of helping governments pay for the services that we all enjoy? Is it a way of ensuring that governments have sufficient money to invest in new areas and to support people who need extra support? Or is it a way potentially of influencing behaviour and incentivizing certain activities in an economy to try and push it in a certain direction? I think the answers are yes to all of the above of those. Hopefully we're going to move those of you who think it might be a little bit dull or tired or boring. We're going to move you into the slightly more it's exciting category over the course of this session. But yes, I think it's a very exciting time, as it is for most areas when it comes to the use of technology, and we're going to give you a glimpse into what we think that means. The three topics that I'd like to talk through with you and give you some examples of are here in front of you now. The three topics are: digital change is also equal to tax change. Technology is also changing tax supervision. And organizations are no longer in control of the image they project. And with these three topics, these three impacts that we see from technology, we think that tax is going to completely change going forward. The relationship between the taxpayer as a corporate and the tax authority is going to completely change. And we all need to be ready for that as tax professionals and as budding people who want to work in this field. So to take each one of those in turn. Digital change is equal to tax change. The first one of these is quite an interesting one. It goes back to the kind of basics of tax. The way in which we tend to tax organizations is we tend to look for where value is created within a business structure. In the old world, that was incredibly easy. You'd have a company that would build, let's say, widgets. They would manufacture in one location. They would ship to another location where they would market and perhaps sell those goods. And then they would be moved on to the end consumer. It was very easy to determine where the value in that business model was being generated. All the marketing spend, all the branding, all of these sorts of things were very easy to put in a certain location. If we fast forward to today, we have a very different set of challenges, and technology is changing business models across the economy. So taking the example that I had before, now we're not making widgets, but instead we're making, as you can see here, a gas turbine. Let's suggest this gas turbine is sitting in South America, and perhaps it changes its output based on an algorithm. So it has sensors within the system that says, okay, we need to increase or decrease output based on a certain set of parameters. That algorithm has perhaps been developed by someone in California on the West Coast of the US, and is perhaps hosted on the Swiss cloud. Yeah, so it's hosted on infrastructure here in Switzerland. Now, where is the value within that business structure? Does it sit with the machine itself? Does it sit with the algorithm and the people who've created that? Or does it sit where the algorithm is actually based, where the decisions are ultimately being taken? It's a question that's still got both corporates and the economy and governments discussing this topic. It's still not necessarily confirmed, but it's a big question that people need to think about, and that has an impact on the way in which businesses are structured. So I was speaking to some clients who have hosted a lot of their tech talent, so their software developers in certain locations, based on the cost of living, based on the cost of salaries. So strategic and operational decisions, they've based their expertise in certain locations that perhaps aren't optimal from a tax perspective. And when you're separating the tax perspective, these decisions become a bit more difficult to make. But the first thing to think about when thinking about this new world of tax is the digital change, the change that we see right in front of us in the pages of the newspapers and out with the companies that we interact with, is also having an impact on the taxes we pay and where we pay them. And if we think back to the one of the main tenets of tax, the fact that it's helping governments to support their local societies, it becomes an even more politically charged question. Am I paying the right or the quote unquote fair amount of tax? And am I paying it in the right places? So that is going to, in and of itself, is going to change the way in which companies think about tax and the way in which us as tax professionals work. The second topic that I would like to talk about is that technology is changing tax supervision. So we do quite a lot of consulting here at PwC with our corporate clients to help them to improve the way in which they deliver tax, be that helping them to develop and to build their tax returns in a much quicker fashion, much more efficiently at lower cost, or helping them to manage risk in a much more effective manner. The technologies that we use for those companies can also be used by tax authorities. And if we think about the kind of things that technology can do to help us and to improve things that we use in our daily lives, we can probably categorize that in one of 3 or 4 main categories. Technology today is very good at taking a large amount of data, categorizing that data into certain data fields, comparing that data to a rule book, and then making some decisions off the back of it. And if we think about what tax authorities do, they do very similar things. They take a large amount of data from the tax return, they categorize it into types of expenditure, capital or expense. They compare it to a rule book, which is the tax legislation, and then they make decisions. Is this taxable or not, and at what rate? So if you think about that at basic level, the technology that's on the market and reasonably easily accessible today is going to be very good at replacing a lot of what tax authorities are doing. And tax authorities have learned this. They've seen how other companies are digitizing, and they've seen that a lot more data is now readily available through companies putting all this data online and hosting it in IT systems. And they've said, well, hang on, we could use some of this to improve the way in which we supervise our corporates. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a large amount of investment happening by tax authorities to improve the way in which they supervise their corporates. So just to give you a couple of examples to make that a bit more real for you, I've got a bit of a loaded question here. What do Russian cash registers and your holiday rentals have in common? The answer is they're both amazingly detailed sources of information for tax authorities to use. In Russia, all of the cash registers in your standard shops, not only function of that particular shop or business, they also have a direct feed to the government. And so all of those transactions are processed in almost real time by the government. Trillions of transactions a month go through the systems of the government, and they can collect that data. They can use that data to identify potential fraud. And they also then can use that to supervise and to see how the economy is going. So slightly closer to home, being Airbnb, and indeed close to home for me because it's from the UK. The UK authorities have spent about 5 years investing in a new platform that they call Connect, HMRC Connect. And what that can do is that can take data from a number of different data sources, be it Airbnb or eBay, or the land registry of property, who owns certain properties, and can then link that data back to tax tax filings. With that, they're able to gather brand new insights on the way in which people run their businesses, run their livelihoods, and have their tax affairs. And with this, they can use that to then ask questions. And they do that in the case of Airbnb by asking very simple questions through letters. At the end of the tax year, they will send a letter out to taxpayers saying, you know that flat that you're renting out in London, we see you've rented it out 130 days in the year. Are you sure you've declared all of that on your tax return? It's interesting example in behavioral nudging, because I'm sure a lot of people say, oh, I've forgotten about that. Or perhaps I'd only disclosed maybe 80 of those days. So it's worked a great deal of effort and very successful in improving the disclosure of tax-related topics. That's the first example. The second example, I will pass over to my colleague, Jeremy, because it's from his own home country.
Yes, so hi everyone. This is an example closer to me. It's an example coming from the Netherlands, because in the Dutch tax system, you're allowed to drive a company car for private use if you keep it to a limit of 500 kilometers a year. Well, you can already guess that this is causing a lot of trouble and people trying to avoid paying taxes over it. And the tax authorities tried to be clever and started using all the highway traffic cameras all around the entire country to identify what they were suspecting. People were actually committing fraud with their company cars. So they were tracking the amount of people who were claiming to be at one place and actually were in a different place. This was a good basis to detect all the fraud, and with that, get the taxes they needed and were actually due. Until one person thought, no, I'm not taking this. This is in violation of Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. So he went to court, as one does, and he won. And it went up and down, and the court decided that the tax authorities were allowed to use it up until the highest Dutch Supreme Court, who decided that at the end of the day, it is in violation. And one would think that this is the end of the story, but it isn't, because the tax authorities declared last year that they found a new way to detect a different type of tax fraud and are looking into legally also trying to track down this same tax fraud using these same cameras. And this is just an example of everything around us being used by the tax authorities to detect fraud and get the taxes they actually need to collect.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jeremy. More from you a little bit later. Some great examples there of tax authorities investing in new technologies that helps them to get access to new types of data. The third example that I want to talk to you a little bit about, which gives you even more of a sample of what the authorities are doing, is the fact that the organizations are no longer in control of the image that they project to the outside world. Now, this follows the idea that in the old world, the only way that tax authorities would really have an understanding of how businesses operate would be through the tax return. Through the tax return, which is disclosed and submitted to the tax authorities, through perhaps the financial statements, which again are disclosed on an annual basis, and other interviews and discussions that tax authorities were having with corporate clients. Now, there is lots of data out there that's been put out there by corporates, by their staff, by media outlets, by news providers, where a third party can piece together that information and get a picture of the organization that's different, perhaps, to the tax returns and the financial statements that are published in PDF format, right? That are very, very simple, very flat, and you can't really dig into that data very easily. And we have an example here using social media as a source for some of this information. And here we have an example of a company that is headquartered in the United States. It's a clothing apparel company. This is a client that we worked with, who had manufacturing and retail positions all across the globe, but maintained that their headquarter and all of their brand value, so a very important thing for tax purposes, all of their brand sat in the United States. So the status quo position was that they paid tax just predominantly in the US. They would, of course, pay taxes in different locations based on local profits, but the bulk of their profits would be taxed in the United States. Now, in Italy, the Italian authorities said, well, let's just have a look into this and test this hypothesis. So they had a look on LinkedIn. And on LinkedIn, they found someone who was doing what people quite often do on LinkedIn, perhaps upselling his job, let's call it, a little bit, perhaps saying he was a little bit more responsible for more things than perhaps he was, who said, I am responsible for branding. So for the company's brand across the whole of EMEA. So the whole of the European region. The Italian authorities saw this. They said, well, hang on a second. If you have somebody responsible for building the brand in Europe, it follows that there must be some brand value. So this person, his work, his or her work, must also sit in the European region. And if there's some brand value there needs to be some profits allocated to that brand. Which ultimately means there should be some Italian taxes being paid that are not being paid currently. And so they actually they used social media information, in this case LinkedIn, to open an audit into that business to check in the details. Now, the structures that were put in place were effective and they were right. But the problem here is that the company had to spend time and money and effort to defend themselves against a claim that was brought to them through social media. Now, I don't know whether this person still perhaps works for this company in turn. I can assure you he's probably changed his LinkedIn profile, but it just gives you a sense of there are lots of other data points out there. The company and the corporate is not able to control the message as well as it has done in the past. You might say that's a good thing. What it is it's something that companies now need to be aware of. And I think that's something that is changing over the course of the last perhaps 18 months or 2 years, is that companies now need to understand these outlets and put them in and put measures in place to understand what messages are being broadcast to the outside world from areas that are outside of their control. So, a very quick whirlwind tour of what we think the future of tax looks like in 3 main themes. The first one, digital change equals tax change. So whenever companies are changing their business model, putting in place new e-commerce facilities, moving to the cloud, which is quite a common thing that we see nowadays, digitizing their business and putting a lot of that information onto computer hard disks and into the cloud. That also has an impact on the tax perspective of that business. That's number one to think about. Number two, the world of supervision is completely changing as a result of the same technologies that we use to help companies. And that is going to completely change the relationship between the authorities and taxpayers. Taxpayers used to have the benefit of only having the tax return as the main disclosure and then being able to answer any questions that came along perhaps 12 months later when things had already happened. Whereas with the current technology that's being implemented today, similar to those Russian cash registers, if you think back, the tax authorities are getting that information at the same time as the corporate. So there's no benefit of timing, which the corporates have, which helps them to justify their position and ensure that their data is correct. It has to be correct first time. So there's a lot more required of the corporate to ensure that their data is correct, that it is submitted on time, and then it paints the right picture to understand any risk that might be part of that. And then the third topic is the organizations are no longer in control of that image. And that's, again, something where companies need to start thinking about what other data sets are there in the world that we could or could be used by somebody to draw some conclusions around how taxable our business is. With those three, I think there has been no more exciting time to be in tax as a result of this. But I do think it means that we need a special set of skills for people who are coming into the industry going forward. And I think this is perhaps the bit that's the most important bit for all of you listening on the webcast today, is what do I need to do to ensure that I'm ready for this? How can I be that person who works in tax and is ready for this new world? Well, we did some thinking, Jeremy and I, And we've come up with 5 main areas that we think you should be thinking about when you're preparing yourself for this world. And so we'll talk through those briefly now. Of course, number 1 is, as it always has been, it's incredibly important to stay up to date with tax legislation, with regulatory change, and with the general rules that are across borders and in different regions. I would say it's even more important now because back when I joined, probably 10 years ago, and before then, the tax legislation hadn't changed materially because business models hadn't really changed. In the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of business models have changed, and the regulators and governments have finally woken up to the fact that this is something that necessitates a change in regulation. So there are new regulations being published almost monthly that amend the way in which things are being treated so that they meet new tax tests and new tax regulations. So it's become even more important to stay up to date with things as they're changing. It also gives a lot of room for interpretation and for learning new things. So it's learning something as you are now in your studies will do you really well for getting you into a job. But it's one of these things where constant learning is really key, because things will change and interpretations of law and guidance will change quite frequently. And so it's important to keep up to date with things. So again, that's a kind of keenness to keep learning and to be on top of these developments is a key skill for people, anyone coming into the tax arena, kind of in your own position. The second one, embracing automation. I think this is a very positive trend to be aware of. So computers have got to the stage now that they can automate very quite complex processes quite simply. So there are tools out there on the market today they're called RPA, robotic process automation. Tools like these, they work on your standard desktop, and they have a very simple user interface, and they allow you to automate processes. And that could be anything from automating your check-in for your flights when we can fly again, right the way through to automating an Excel spreadsheet to calculate certain things and to pull data from different sources. In the old world of tax, whilst a lot of people got into tax because of the technical part of it, a large portion of the work in certain corporates is focused on Excel manipulation, getting the numbers right, and processing things. That's stuff that's quite repetitive. It can be prone to risk because you're having to do things again and again, and so the risk of you of doing something wrong or copying a figure quite incorrectly goes up. So automation, now that comes to the fore, that can replace a lot of that tedious work that's currently undertaken in offices, which allows us not only to reduce the risk of things going wrong because the computer does it or the robot does it same time, same way, every time, but it also allows us to do more interesting stuff. It frees up our professionals to focus on the really tax value add topics. So I think this is a really exciting time to be getting into the tax field, because it means if you're able to embrace automation and understand what it can do for you, you can also then deploy that, and then you can focus your own efforts and your own time on the really interesting stuff around tax structuring and helping the business in cases of mergers and acquisitions or other deal situations, the stuff that people get into tax to do in the first place, rather than just using Excel spreadsheets. So that's something to have on your radar and to look into as well. Hand in hand with that, keeping up to date with digital trends. So as I say, RPA is the flavor of the moment. It's the trend that's working at the moment, but I'm sure in a few years' time, there will be a new kid on the block that will be automating different tools and topics and helping us do our job better and more effectively. So keeping up to date with those and to understanding how to bring those into whichever organization you work in, be that a corporate or a non-for-profit, or indeed in government as well. Understanding those digital trends and keeping up to date with them is really important. And it's something that I'm sure Jeremy will talk to you a little bit about when we talk about our own journey internally. Number 4, becoming a T. What's a T, I hear you ask? I believe it was McKinsey, but a well-known consultancy, once came up with the idea of T consultants and I consultants, or T professionals and I professionals. I professionals are incredibly deep, have incredibly deep expertise in a single area and can talk at length at that area, but they don't necessarily have the breadth of expertise to be able to talk across lots of different topics. That's tremendously important when you have very complex topics to have to deal with. You need the expert in the room to think about that. So there is always a place for I professionals, but increasingly, because of the complexity and the change that's happening at the moment, people who are able to talk in detail at one area, but talk across a broad spectrum of different topics at a supervision or at a high level, become much more valuable. If you're able to talk a lot about capital gains tax or profit taxes, but also able to talk about VAT to a degree, you become a lot valuable to the organization and you can deliver a lot more value to that organization. So I would also say, have a think about that. Know what your specialism is, but also know how to talk about other topics too. So I think that will help make you even more valuable and help you really in any field, whether you stay in tax or whether you go into other areas. The recipe for success, in my view, is to ensure that you're able to talk about a lot of different topics and to understand the crossovers, the intersections between those. And the last one to think about is then AI is your friend. So there's a lot in media and sort of public sentiment that AI is coming along to take all of our jobs and it will be the death knell for us working. Some might like that, some might not want to work, right? But I think a lot of us are keen to have something to do, right? I think a lot of those claims that AI is coming to take our jobs are overblown. I once heard a person from one of the senior computer scientists from Google say that AI is currently able to do things that a human would take 1 second to think about. So things like, is this picture a picture of a cat? Yes or no? It would take us 1 second to do, like a computer can do that more or less. Now, anything more complex can't do it yet. So on that basis, I'm happy that my AI can work out whether my photo is a cat or not, but I'm not worried that it's going to take my job anytime soon. But what it can do is it can take little bits of our jobs, which then allows us to focus on the more value-add stuff. So again, understanding that AI is not necessarily coming to take all of our jobs, but can help, and to understand where it can help will stand you in great stead for doing this in the future. So they were the 5 topics that we wanted to talk about. We'll pause here for the kind of technical content, if you like. What I'd like to do now is to talk a little bit more about both my and Jeremy's background and our careers, because I think it's really important for you guys to hear what do we actually do? What do we do day to day? How have we got to where we get to? And our own experiences, because that hopefully will give you a sense of, is this the right career option for you? Is PwC the right place for you if you're thinking about something like that? And so we'll spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about that, and then we'll have 5 minutes at the end to kind of wrap up and answer any questions that you might have. So the first one as well is under the heading, the modern day tax careers are evolving. So this is my story of how I've come to where I am today, and hopefully gives you a sense of how varied a career in quote unquote tax will be. So I've now been with PwC for 11 and a half years, nearly 12 years. I joined in 2008. I joined at a university in London. I joined just at the right time, because as soon as I joined in the September of that year. Towards the end of September and into October, Lehman Brothers happened and the global financial crisis really came to a head. So that was a fantastic time for me to join an accounting and finance profession, right? Nobody knew what was happening. The world was imploding, and it was all very difficult. But having said that, it was a learning curve, right? It was a learning curve. There were lots of things, lots of doors were closing at that time. Other avenues were opening. And for me, working in a consultancy such as PwC gave me the opportunity to explore new options and new avenues. But I joined in personal tax, firstly. I worked in a team that's called People and Organisation now. And essentially what we did was we helped companies move their staff around the globe. So secondees and short-term business visitors, we would help them move their divisional CEOs around, do the compliance, so tax returns for those locations, and consult. If you've got a local CEO who wants to move countries, he needs his kids to be in a good school, needs housing. Obviously, that has an impact. So we help them with that whole situation. So we did all of that. That lasted me perhaps about 18 months or so. I enjoyed the exposure to get out and speak to clients very, very quickly with a role like that. And having that experience is invaluable. You can do a lot from sitting at your desk, but unless you're actually out speaking to clients, you're not really developing those skills from a consulting perspective. And for me, liking to talk, it was a great thing to be able to go and sit down with clients and talk through their own problems. So that lasted me about 18 months. I then moved into a slightly different area of our tax practice, which focused on incentives. So pay, bonuses, share plans, all of these sorts of things for large corporates. Of course, there's a tax aspect to those. Where am I going to be taxed for these stock awards and how much? But equally, there's an incentive piece of this. So there's a psychology part of this. How am I incentivizing the right behaviors in my staff, and how am I ensuring that people are driving in the same direction? It was also a time just after the financial crisis when regulators had decided that the reason why everything had gone quite so sideways was because of bankers not being paid in a risk-adjusted way. So they were being paid to sell complex financial instruments to your grandmother, and there was no repercussions for that. So there was a raft of new regulations that came out, which then companies had to understand and digest and decode. And so coming in at a time like that, so a time of change, which is a time we're seeing in PwC too, and kind of in tax more broadly, means that nobody has the benefit over you, because nobody knows the answer when things are new. And you, as a sharp young thing who can decode stuff just as quickly as superiors, if not quicker, places you at a level playing field with others. So moving into an area where there's lots of change can do a really good things for your career, if you're willing to take a position and to understand stuff. So I did that. I then came up on 6 years in the UK, enjoyed myself in London. Of course, it's a great city, right? I mean, I come from it, so I'm biased, but still a great city, but wanted something new. Felt the calling of the Alpine air, so we thought, okay, myself and my wife came over to Switzerland. We've now been here for 6 years. And in that time, I've now done, I think, about 3 jobs here at PwC. The first one, staying much in that regulation kind of area. The second one, looking into technology and how the tax functions and authorities are changing, which is my most recent one. And as part of that, I also now have moved into some software development, because we as PwC and all the other consultancies now need to deliver software that helps our clients deliver on some of these regulations. And so we now need to I now find myself needing to get an understanding of how software is built, interfacing with software engineers, business types, marketing people, product developers, all of these sorts of things. So a wide-ranging job that is nothing like what I would have imagined I would be doing 10 years ago, but it's with the same firm. So I've changed geographies, I've changed roles, all within the same organization. And whenever I've had that desire to do something different, the firm's always supported me in delivering that. So that's my background. Hopefully that's been helpful for all of you to see that. I'll now hand over to Jeremy, who can then talk a little bit about his experience, which is a little bit more recent.
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart. So yes, my background is a bit different. I joined the firm almost 2 years ago, actually still studying, doing my master's in law and tax with a specialization on tax and technology. It was the first one in the world at that time. I think it still is. And I was studying in Amsterdam at that time because I'm Dutch, and I got an offer to join PwC as a trainee initially. and I never left. I actually completed my master's like a month ago or two. So it's all very fresh. In that time, I have had a good number of changes as well. I started with the idea of joining the tax technology team. I moved to internal transformation of a specific team. Then during that time, I started building a lot of technology blocks within our department, trying to build that up further. Then I also went out to get a new client, back into transformation, ending up into a position I really enjoy now, which is enabling our firm to work better with the technology we have, help them improve their way of working, of which I want to show you something, because every bad timing has a good side to it, of course. And although Corona really isn't a positive thing, if you want to go and work with digital things, move people to work more digitally, Corona has been a blessing in disguise, to be very honest. And I want to show you what happened, because if I show you this, you all know what it means. It means working from home. It means that we need to work remotely, do our presentations also remotely. And these are all kind of things that we need to work with. It obviously gives us funny things, like, working from home on the refrigerator or even on your washing machine. We've seen it all. And we got a heads up that, of course, we would all get this, and then we would need to start working on a couple of things. So what we did is, as soon as possible, we used our intranet. We worked up a site with tips and tricks and ways for people to get working. It's actually still one of the largest sites within the firm. And it went up and running within the first day of everyone sitting at home and waiting what's going to happen. And all of this gave us the opportunity to start teaching people. And this is something I really enjoyed. And out of this sprung something I called the Digital Cafe. On a regular occasion, I will show people what to do, give them tips and tricks, give them insights to technology, but also give them ways of working, which would help them improve. And these are some of the examples. And I like to keep it light. I like to keep it fun, because I think if you enjoy what you do, you do it better. And then I asked people to share some of their pictures of home office. And this was one of them, a person I was working with very closely at the time, who had kids, or still has kids, luckily, and was working from the outside. I love this one. The seesaw was one of my favorite. You can obviously also decide to go business on top and not business downstairs. And this one I really enjoyed. It's actually our partner who loves sci-fi and shared this one with us. Yes, it's just hilarious. We just have fun with it as well. And then I was trying out a lot of new technology at that time, including a different video setup that's not this. And this is things we're working on. So it's a lot of things changing, and you're changing of your roles within the firm, and you get to enjoy it even more and more to a certain point in time where you love working so much that you don't want to stop. And the firm gives you a lot of possibilities to actually achieve that, and that's really great.
Awesome.
Right?
Yeah, so that gives you a good sense, hopefully, of how varied careers can be. I think the thing to take away from that is, if you see something you want to do and you are passionate enough about it, often the firm will be able to facilitate that. And so you can see that with both myself and Jeremy, where we've worked internationally, we've studied, we've worked in different areas. The firm's been behind us to help us with all of that. So with that, we are nearly at time. We have about 4 minutes left. And I see we do have a couple of questions that I just wanted to answer before we do close the session. Of course, we can talk later, and if you do have additional questions, you can get in touch with our HR colleagues on the website, and we can endeavour to answer any further questions you may have. So the first question we have from Stefan: how difficult is it to work internationally in this field, as tax laws are regulated nationally? Do I have to decide on a workplace at the beginning, because changes are not really possible? And I would say with that, yes, there is an element of nationality, if you like, to tax legislation. But often they follow similar logic. Yeah? And indeed, we are seeing a lot of a lot of alignment at intranational levels, so at regional levels. So, for example, the EU, or with large trade deals, the OECD. So that's the kind of G20 organization for economic cooperation. And that is trying to enforce a lot more standardization across tax laws, mainly due to not wanting to have tax avoidance measures in place, and this whole media debate around the fairness of tax. So I would say, yes, there is some, and it's important to have a local understanding to start your career, but that doesn't by any means reduce your scope to work internationally. You know, I've worked in different countries. I would say probably 40 to 50% of the people I know and work with in TLS, so tax across the different countries, have had some sort of international experience, because the skills you learn in one area are very transferable to different areas. Yeah? That's the first one. The second one we have, Evelyn. I wish to work in tax in the future, but I haven't a lot of tax knowledge so far, just the tax planning course. What is your belief of a good choice in the view of future development? I think on that front, tax experience that you can get is helpful, of course. It helps you to understand how these legislations are together and how they work, but they're not the be-all and end-all. As I mentioned a little earlier in the presentation, it's also important to have a good understanding of technology and how that works. But there are so many other soft and hard skills that you can make use of that will make you a successful tax consultant. This maybe comes to another question here, but I actually come from an engineering background, a heavy engineering background, mechanical engineering. And I've used a lot of the skills that I learned in my studies in my day-to-day business quite regularly. And then you have communication, you have stakeholder management. All of these softer skills are equally as important as the tax experience that you get, or finance and accounting. So yeah, I think tax and accounting is an important skill to have. It's not the only one. So if you don't have that, it doesn't mean that you're precluded from a career at PwC or any of the others that are out there. Sarah, you ask, is a specific educational background necessary? As I mentioned, not necessarily. Obviously, it helps because it helps to show that you're committed to a certain area. And indeed, you have to do less learning when you join. But it's by no means the be-all and end-all. And indeed, we do try and hire people from different backgrounds, because ultimately what's important is the relationship with your clients. And you know, whilst I know that us accountants and tax professionals are an exciting bunch of people, we don't get along with everyone. Yeah, so you need people from different backgrounds to be able to make relationships with different clients. Quite a lot of clients might come from a literature background, or might be really scientific, and so we need people who can interface with those people. So you need a completely different, a tapestry of different skills to be able to be successful. So no, it's not a specific one. We take people from lots of different areas. It's about showing interest, keenness, willingness to learn, and excitement for kind of making relationships and building those out. I have time for one more, so this will be the last question from Olin. Do people coming from different studies work differently? For example, whether one has studied law or business? Yes, I would say they probably do. I mean, we all learn different sets of skills and different ways of tackling problems depending on how we learn. But that's no bad thing, because we need people from different areas to tackle problems in different ways. Otherwise, we have this bias where we only think about things in a certain way. So you need to put teams together who have experience and expertise from lots of different areas. And that's what we endeavour to do at PwC. So that is all we have time for today. I hope it's been insightful. We've given you a sense of where we think tax frameworks are moving due to technology, and indeed shared with you a little bit of experience from myself and Jeremy's own careers. Hopefully that's given you a bit of a sense of how things work here at PwC. And spurred you to learn a little bit more. So with that, we'd like to close the webcast and thank you for joining us today.